The World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi begins this Friday, the 26th of November. I can't wait. But before then, well, there's a shadow which is falling over this match because a potential world title challenger is emerging. I want to tell you about the latest exploits of Alireza Firouzja. Remember, he won a place in next year's candidates by winning the FIDEchess.com Grand Swiss Tournament in Riga very recently. And he's now flown over to Slovenia, and he was playing in the European Team Championship, representing France, of course. He's now a French citizen. And what a result he had. So, going into this final round, I mean, France as a team were playing extremely well. They're now becoming a real force in world chess. And they had a chance to actually win the tournament. In the final round, if Alireza could win his final game against Mamedyarov, then he would get to number 2 in the live rating list. Let's have a look. I mean, some of his games in this tournament were absolutely superb. But, of course, playing Mamedyarov, not an easy one. It's a giocopiano, and, well, this is such a tense opening. Because although it's piano at first, you don't get these big clashes of pieces in the middle. Tension builds for many, many moves. Pieces remain on the board. And, if you're looking to prolong the tension, then this is a very good opening for that. So Alireza already has a lot of experience from this position. He's already played it, well, my database tells me that against Wesley So, against Ding, against Ariane Tari, and he's played various things here. He's tried Bishop B3, Bishop B5. He went for the very standard Knight D2. And here, well, you might recall in Riga, I showed this game on the channel. Alireza played Bishop B5 against David Howe and won a very, very tense game. But in this game, he simply exchanged on E6. To my eyes, Black is doing absolutely fine here. Normally, this exchange on E6 shouldn't trouble Black too much because Black is going to gain counterplay on the F file. There's sometimes the potential to push forward D5. I mean, those important D5 and F5 squares are covered. But it is just a tense position. No pawn exchanges so far. This little advance on the queen side could maybe in the long term be quite nice for Black, but it's too early to say. But here is a big moment in the game where Black has to decide whether you push pawns, whether you try to play on the king side, maybe in the centre. So, for example, you could just wait here. You could play Queen E7, or Queen E8 is also fine. And maybe just wait a little bit to see what develops. Queen E8, of course, facilitates Knight H5 and potentially Knight F4. Queen E7, you can maybe double on the F file. Got to protect this guy at some point. But Mamedyarov likes to push forward. And instead of that, he played D5. Well, the rook came back, so that preempts Black playing D4. But Black could play D4 here. Is this a good or bad transaction for White or Black? Very hard to say. But that's possible. But Mamedyarov just played B5, which looks very logical to protect this pawn. That means he can free the rook for action later on. Firouzja exchanged on D5. Now, of course, Black would very much like to recapture with the pawn to straighten everything out, but of course that loses a pawn here. So knight takes, but this is the point that this knight now gets access to this square F4. A3. Also, there's another little threat here, apart from knight F4. And that's pawn to a3 to undermine the protection for this pawn. So that's why a3 was played. Knight f4, rook e3. Now, if black wants, actually, it seems to me that black can force a draw here just by playing knight d5. And I don't think white has much alternative here than just to repeat the position. The rook can go back, but anyway, knight f4. So if Mamedyarov wants it, I think he can take a draw. But it's not his style. He wanted more, and that's understandable. So queen e8, and the queen looks to come to g6. It's understandable because g2 is a little bit vulnerable. d3 is a little bit vulnerable. So, you know, the queen move also makes room for the rook to attack the pawn on d3. So, you know, if knight takes pawn here, then you can see that queen coming to g6, hits g2, knight h3 threatened, knight d3 threatened. That's uncomfortable. So Alireza played g3, hitting the knight. Knight takes pawn. So Mamedyarov has won a pawn. However, the knight goes back to g5, and that means that white can exchange and play queen g4. So with that little transaction, white has stabilized here. You can see these double pawns not really great, and they give access to the g4 and e4 squares for white. So positionally that's quite nice, but still black has potential to build up pressure on the f file and also the d file too. So it's actually, there's a kind of dynamic balance here, but it's very tense. Rook f5, so that protects the pawn, protects both pawns, and prepares to double on the f file. Queen f7, some nice pressure here, so the knight can't move because of rook f2. Queen e4, well, that's an excellent move. Spinning over and attacking that knight, and if the knight goes back, then, well, at the moment, of course, the knight can't retreat because of the pin, so therefore rook f8. Now, if queen takes knight, then g4, and, well, black is going to break through here. But first of all, rook h1, good move. That sets up some activity on the h file, and that, as we'll see, that actually is very useful later on. This is a very subtle position, a very tense position. My computer, for various obscure reasons, thinks that queen f6 is the correct move here, and it should end in a draw. Okay, I'll just show you very quickly. Here's the main line. After this, exchange everything, and then queen e6. And that's a draw by perpetual check. I mean, I'm sure, you know, there are other lines as well, but that's basically the rationale. Mamedyarov instead plays g6, and there's a little bit of a difference here. We're going to see the difference here. So obviously the knight can't move because the rook crashes in. So king g1. Now if pawn takes, then actually the pawn here just blunts all these pieces. Queen b5, and white is just better in that position because black's major pieces have nothing to do. So rook f3, some exchanges, queen e6. So it's rather like the other variation. If the king comes up, then white is going to be better after queen takes pawn check. So, and here, of course, rook f7, the g6 pawn could be taken. So here the queen has to come back. Now, not queen takes pawn, because queen takes pawn here is checkmate. That would be suboptimal. So after queen f7, Firouzja simply exchanged. So we've had a wholesale exchange of pieces. We've arrived in rook and pawn endgame. But you can see that these pawns are isolated. These are a little bit loose as well. White's pawn structure is just a bit better. That pawn is loose. But yeah, there are more loose black pawns here. And there we go. We can see it was worth activating that rook on the h-file. So I don't know what Mamedyarov missed in that sequence, but g6 was the culprit, basically. So here we just have a mass liquidation. Both sides go for pawns. Black has to keep up with white. If black just falls back to defend, then it's going to be too easy for white. So black has to just keep threatening pawns to try to liquidate, basically. Here, and yeah, this just leads to all the pawns being exchanged. That's pretty forced, actually. And e4 is a good move. So now we have a very tight endgame where white's obviously a pawn up. Now, usually with so few pawns, it should be a draw. But of course, black has to be very careful. And the fact that this is actually a passed pawn does make a difference. If we shifted that pawn across, let's say, to g5, easy draw. But with the pawn, passed pawn here, then this is actually quite tricky. If the king goes forward, then rook e5. Well, that's exactly what white wants. The rook protects the f-pawn, and then this one will run. Not good. So king f6 is correct. Okay, what's white's first step here? How can white try to squeeze something from this position? Well, if the g-pawn is simply advanced here, it's not going to get very far. First of all, king f1. So there's no point in pushing the g-pawn. It's best kept on g3 for the moment, where at least it's protected by its brother on f2. So the king comes round. So this is an obvious threat to advance the pawn, the king to attack the pawn. So rook b3, and well, obviously that stops it. So the rook just prevents white's king advancing. Okay, so what does white do now? What's the next step? Well, this is really nice actually, because Firouzja brings the rook down. So black waits, there's nothing that black can do. And now gives a check. And this is a very difficult decision for black, because one would like to stay in front of the g-pawn. But now the king is cut from this pawn, so you can see that white would just win the pawn very easily, and rook takes pawn on the next turn. So after the check, the king has to come to e5, but that means that the king is now cut off from the g-pawn, so that gives white some hope. Now, if that pawn is advanced straight away, then white it doesn't get anywhere. Basically, the king can't join to help the g-pawn. So eventually the rook is going to be able to stop it, and yeah, it's not good enough. So first of all, the king comes round. Now I'm going to return to this position at the end because there's something rather remarkable about this position. But let me show you what happened in the game. So king d4, king comes up, rook b7, king h3. So this king is able to support the g-pawn, and in this position actually Mamedyarov simply resigned, and there is no defense. He is completely lost now. Okay, let's have a quick look why. So if rook g7, king g3, rook g6, rook f5 check. So this forces the king to make a decision. If the king comes here, then the king will emerge to support the g-pawn. Easy win for white. If the king comes back, then the king advances. And basically this pawn is getting rounded up, or the g pawn is going to go forward. So here rook f6 check is a threat, and if the king comes back, then simply rook e5 and rook takes pawn, and of course two connected pass pawns, easy win. So what went wrong for Mamedyarov? You know, it's very strange. Well, there's a story here. It was in fact a draw. We go back over 100 years to the game Teichmann against Alapin from the Prague International Masters Tournament in 1908. Yes, hot Endgame theory from 1908. And Simon Alapin, of course, he of Alapin's defense, or Alapin's opening, yeah, with e4, c5, 2c3, as well as knight e2. That's another story. Here, Alapin found the correct defense. So if you remember that Firouzja simply managed to bring the king over, and then he advanced the pawn. So how does black stop that? Well, Alapin found this clever move, rook f3. Now this looks very odd. It would seem like the king and pawn endgame must be losing. But watch. In fact, this is a draw. Now if the king tries to come around here, that's no good at all. The king can block it out. Okay, so king e1. Let's see. In fact, black's king blocks out white's king, like this. And white cannot gain your position. If, let's say, king b2, well, you don't want to carry this too far because then the g-pawn will roll. But in this case, the king can dive in, take the f-pawn, and both sides make a queen. And of course, that's just a draw. And let's go back. So what happens if pawn to g4? Well, black is just in time. I mean, obviously the g-pawn can be caught, but it's not just that. Watch what happens when white brings the king over to take the pawn. That's the key move. Black is just in time to play king f5. And so white cannot win the opposition there, and that, of course, is a theoretical draw. So there we go. In this game, in fact, Teichmann didn't exchange rooks. He appreciated, obviously, that was a draw, and checked. But you can see the difference here. Basically, that rook prevents this king coming up the board because the f-pawn can be taken. And when the white rook came back, well, that simply gives the king more freedom. And in fact, this game is, well, it just ended in a draw. The players shuffled around for some time, but that's the difference. It's all about freeing the king, and it's impossible with the rook here. So there we go. Mamedyarov missed a trick there. And it should have been a draw. However, let's concentrate on the hero of the hour. So Alireza Firouzja, he is now number 2 on the live rating list. So Carlsen has a rating of 2855.9. Alireza Firouzja has a rating of 2803.8. Remember, he's just 18 years of age. Remarkable. He's qualified for the candidates. It seems, in these last 2 events that, everything he touches turns to gold. Or almost. He scored 8 out of 9 in this European Team Championship and helped France to, well, not to victory. They came equal first. Let me just check that. Yeah, they came equal first with Ukraine, but Ukraine won on tiebreak. Congratulations to them, of course. But sensational result from Firouzja, and he really is the coming man. So Well, let's get this World Championship out of the way, but already there are a lot of people looking forward to the Candidates Tournament in 2022 and thinking, wow, if he qualifies, that is really something else. Remember, like, comment, share and subscribe. Tell me, what do you think of Firouzja? Has he got it? Can he sustain his form? And remember, my course on the Kalashnikov Sicilian is on sale, still on sale at Chessable. I'll put the link down there. It's getting great reviews. People like it. Thanks for watching.